Welcome to the TKN Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daryl Williams. The TKN Leadership Podcast exists to help you level up your ministry and level up your leadership. Whether you're a pastor, a layperson, or somebody not even related to the church, the TKN Leadership Podcast is here to help you do next level things and take whatever you're doing to the next level to make a kingdom impact. We're here to let you hear conversations and teachings from some of the best thought minds on leadership in the country. And today, for our first one, we have one of the best leaders in the country. As a matter of fact, he's so good of a leader that Outreach Magazine referenced him this year as he's the pastor of the fastest growing church in America. That's right. Joining me today is Pastor Matthew Watley, the senior pastor of the Kingdom Fellowship AME Church in Calverton, Maryland. Help me welcome Pastor Watley. Dr. Watley, how are you today, sir?
Doing well. Glad to be here and glad to talk about what is my passion, leadership. After preaching, for me, leadership really is my heart's joy because it is the thing that makes the difference in ministry, no matter where you are, no matter where God has assigned you.
Yeah. They say everything rises and falls on leadership. And over the last 4 years, you've had quite an exciting journey. In the last 4 years, you've planted a church, moved through a pandemic, and this year Outreach Magazine named Kingdom Fellowship the fastest growing church in the country. So I'm going to ask you what all of our listeners want to know. We're going to just dive right into it. How'd you do that?
Yeah, so I have no idea how they did the math, how that works, right? But I can tell you that we had an amazing advantage in starting. So we can't really start 4 years ago. You have to sort of go back to 2006 when we started what was then the Reed Temple North campus in Montgomery Blair High School, Silver Spring, Maryland. The biggest advantage we had was that we had great worship and church DNA from our mother church, Reed Temple in Glendale, Maryland. What that translated to was people who followed pastoral leadership. Even though I was not the senior pastor, they followed me as if I was. We had people who were welcoming, people who were willing to serve, people who were open to worship and express their faith out loud. And because of those factors, even though we were in a high school cafeteria worshiping on linoleum, when it was cold outside, it was freezing inside. When it was hot outside, it was blazing inside. But people were willing to put up with those challenges because the ministry itself was impactful. In fact, we actually had an older member from Reed Temple who had started worshiping with us. And Reed had just built its new sanctuary. I was over that construction. And so I said to her one day after service, listen, I'm so glad you're here. Don't take this the wrong way, but why are you worshiping with us? I mean, we're in a high school. We just built this $32 million campus over there. She said, it's 10 minutes from my house. I'm like, yeah, but we're in a cafeteria. She's like, but it's 10 minutes from my house. So the advantage of location, the advantage of healthy culture really helped us to get off to a great start. And so that ministry began in 2006, and we just experienced exponential growth year after year. In 2010, we were able to acquire a space and build it out as our worship facility. And from 2010 to 2019, we worshiped there as Reed Temple North. In 2019, our senior pastor, Dr. Lee P. Washington, retired. And the bishop then chose to say, hey, listen, we're going to have you take your campus and make that a separate church. That's how we became Kingdom Fellowship 4 years ago. And it was great because we were then able to take that healthy DNA and reimagine it. It allowed us to hit the reset button. As great as things were going, we were able to then cast an even more, I would say, authentic vision for how God was shaping our ministry in that season. And so we started in 2019. We continued to grow. And by then, we had acquired space, we had acquired land, and we were preparing to build our new worship facility. So all this is going on in 2019, starting a new campus, building, doing the design and development for the new worship place. And our first anniversary in 2020 of the Kingdom Fellowship AME Church was the last day we were able to worship in person because the pandemic hit.
Couple questions for you. You said a mouthful, and that's an amazing journey just in and of itself. So it shows there was a real foundation there. But let me ask you a couple leadership things in there. Mm-hmm. You started off not as the technical senior pastor and then sort of became head of a campus where you had senior pastoral roles, but you were still answering to someone else, and then ultimately became the senior pastor where it was completely your operation, your organization for you to lead. Can you give us some clues? Because we have a lot of people who watch who are in those different chairs. Somebody who's an executive pastor, somebody who's a campus pastor, plenty of senior pastors. What are the different things that you learned in leadership and the leadership transitions through those types of roles?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one, I think you have to be very honest about where you are sort of at the interpersonal level in your own emotional intelligence. You have to be clear that you can feel fulfilled and actualized if you don't have the quote unquote title of senior pastor. I can't name for you the number of times people came to me and say, "So when are you going to get a church? When are you going to become a senior pastor?" Now, as the executive minister and leading the North Campus, we were seeing, had 3 services, we had 5,000 members, and all the things that come with that. But for some people, the lack of having the title senior pastor meant that I still was not a legitimate minister. So I had to be careful not to use somebody else's ruler to measure the effectiveness of my ministry.
Now, I want you to say that again, because a lot of times we get trapped in comparison. We get trapped in what other people are saying. Tell us more about not using someone else's ruler to measure your ministry, having your own metrics.
Sure. So you have to have a clear understanding of who God has called you to be, what God has called you to do, and where he's called you to do it. I don't believe that everyone is effective everywhere. So if you look at, say, the ministry of Jesus, he was tremendously effective sometimes and tremendous failure other times, like when he went back to Nazareth. And he could do no great work because of their unbelief. Like Paul, who sometimes would go into a town, start a church, everything was great. Other times they'd stone him, arrest him, beat him with rods. So it says to me that my ministry is not universally portable. And that, that the whole concept that some denominations have around the itineracy, that you can just put this person any place and they'll be effective, is extra biblical, right? So I had to be clear that God has called me to this place at this time, to this people, and therefore I need to be clear about what God is saying to me and not what people are saying to me. Then there's some practical ways you can feel very effective about where you are. So some of the people who are saying you should get your own church, so you could be a senior pastor, I could fit their church in my choir stand. So I was like, yeah, I think I'm good. Right? I think I'm okay where I am. So I would say, one, you have to be clear about where you are so that you can be supportive of the senior leadership. So the way that we like to frame it was using, again, scripture, that I, as the executive minister, was not Absalom seeking to unseat the king. And Dr. Washington, as a senior pastor, was not Saul always feeling insecure. Right? And so by both of us being able to be comfortable in our skin and trusting of the other person, even though our personalities are totally, polar opposite. He's an extreme introvert. I'm an extreme extrovert. They actually worked out to be complementary rather than conflictual. So I would say that you have to be clear about who you are, to use your own metric versus somebody else. Keep scripture as the standard for how you define your ministry, and understand that just because there's another opportunity someplace else does not necessarily mean you can be effective there, because I don't believe that we're universally called to every tribe and every people. I think we're called to specific places and people and times. I'd also say that you have to be willing to be passionate about your ministry, but at the end of the day, accept the fact that it may not always work out the way you want it. I like to say it this way: everybody's accountable at some level. If you are the senior pastor, you have to deal with your boards, your trustees and stewards or deacons or elders or whomever, right? If you're on staff, you have to deal with your senior leadership. So all of us have accountability, and none of us are going to get our way the entire time. If you're a pastor, founder, and general overseer, and establishmentarian, great. You still will have to work with people that will require compromise in terms of your vision and the way you want things done. Otherwise, you'll become a totalitarian dictator and you will be on your own. So once you accept that my passion does not mean that I get 100% of my way, that then gives you some leadership equity that you can then negotiate those things that may not turn out the way you want them to. And accept that at the end of the day, it's actually not my church. It's actually not my ministry. It's God's. And ultimately, he is responsible for making all this stuff work.
Now, speaking of making all this stuff work, when we jumped out to kind of talk about some of the leadership transitions, you had just said that on the year's anniversary of Kingdom Fellowship becoming Kingdom Fellowship was right when the pandemic hit. Yet, you had a whole bunch going on at that time, including the building, moving from a temporarily built out location to a full permanent location right at the beginning of the pandemic. Talk to us about that process and the leadership challenges, because you were truly in uncharted territory. I don't know a lot of people who have built in a pandemic, largely because I don't know anybody that was around during rubella and scarlet fever. So tell us how that happened. Tell us about some of the leadership challenges and what you did. I think the audience needs to know what you built.
Sure. So let's go back to 2019 one more time. So I'm named as the senior pastor of Kingdom Fellowship. My first assignment as senior pastor is to actually sign over all of our assets into the name of Kingdom Fellowship, and then to sign the construction loan for our new building. So all that's happening in 2019 on my first day, right? So now 2020, we're now literally getting ready to start building in earnest. We're in March 2020, and construction is supposed to begin in the summer of 2020. So when the pandemic hits, now I've got to decide, do we move forward in a $45 million construction project to add a new construction, about 60,000 square feet, onto an 88,000 square foot existing building? Or do we say, hey, let's put it on pause, let's, be a little more conservative because we don't know how this is going to work out. I don't know if people are going to stop giving. I don't know if we're going to survive as a species. There's a whole lot going on right now. And so I go back to the Bible. I read where Jesus says, hey, listen, before you start building a tower, count the cost. Otherwise, people are going to come and literally make fun of you because you did not act wisely. So I'm like, hey, listen, my ego's not in this. I don't want to have a half-built building. I've seen that before. It's not a good look. So I'm looking for an exit strategy. I'm like, listen, this is not about my ego. I want to be conservative. I want to be responsible. So let's just kind of parry back. So I'm open to building, but I don't want to get ahead of God. So I said, well, listen, maybe the answer's in the process. So let's check with the bank and see if they're ready to pull back on the loan. We call the bank. They're like, yeah, no, you guys are looking great. Move forward. Okay. So we called the general contractor, figuring he may not want to bet on a construction project in the middle of the pandemic. He's like, no, we're good to go. I mean, even to the fact that in the state of Maryland, you could still build because other states were not allowing construction because of the pandemic. And so finally I said, well, you know what, the people will give me the answer. They'll stop giving. After all, we can't even worship physically. And the giving went up. And so that was my sign to say, okay, well, clearly the Lord is in this. Let's move forward. And I'm so grateful to God that we did, because we had no idea at that time about what supply chain issues were and how badly, construction projects could stall, and the price escalation because of the scarcity of supply. And so had we not started when we did, we would have had a much smaller project. We may not have been able to finish the project because of all those related challenges. So truly the hand of God was on us. It was a step of faith, but certainly the Lord sent us people who had a mind to work, both in terms of the team as well as the congregation.
Now, as the leader in this uncharted territory, what did you do differently to lead the people? Because typically as pastors, we've got Sunday morning. That's when we've got everybody in the building. You can bring vision, you can bring energy. You didn't have that in the same way. What did you do to keep the people motivated and lead them as you're in this uncharted territory?
So it's interesting, I used to have an old basketball coach, John McCarthy. His favorite phrase was, crisis does not build character, it reveals character. And so I discovered some things about myself as a person and as a pastor during that time. One was I actually was inspired. I actually was animated and energized and actualized during this season. So I immediately, not only did I start transitioning our online broadcast, because we technically had an online broadcast. In actuality, it was turning the camera on and whatever happened in front of it, that's what we called our online broadcast. So the first Sunday, I sat with my family at home and watched what we had done. And I was like, this is absolutely horrible. This is hot garbage on a breezeless day, and it's not right, and God is not pleased, and the kingdom's not moving forward. So the first move I made was to hire a producer who was actually a member of our church, but tremendously well-credentialed and experienced. And she was able to use the platform that we already had. We had the technical, the equipment and everything, but she was able to put things together in a manner that really was much more engaging visually. We made some adjustments there. The second thing, the first thing was we put in protocols to keep people safe. Then we hired the producer. But then we also recognized, hey, while we're doing this, ministry still needs to go on. And I knew that it was going to be an economic challenge. So we started feeding people. We actually started, and we didn't have like organization. We literally took, a credit card and went down to Costco and bought a bunch of stuff and started handing it out. And that ended up becoming, over the course of the pandemic, a 2-county feeding program where we feed in 7 different locations every week. We have full-time staff devoted just to that. We do diapers now. We have all kinds of partnerships. We actually serve as a hub for other nonprofits for one of those counties. All that was happening concurrently while we're still planning out the construction. So for me, I woke up every day, could leave the house, but in my mind, I was like, wow, this is great. That means I can be locked into work for 12 hours a day without having to commute. And so for me, it was an opportunity to see how can we be innovative in reaching our congregation. So we started to provide all the ministries that we were doing in person through Zoom, through other online platforms, and we were able to connect. And what we realized was that people started to really appreciate even more the quality of ministry that was being presented. In the midst of your normal day, when you have 1,000 things pulling on your time and schedule and family and all that kind of stuff, you may not appreciate what's happening in the ministry. But when people were confined to home, they really had the opportunity to, and the other thing I think was people were more open to the gospel. I mean, nothing sobers you up to the truth about life and death than, a pandemic.
Absolutely.
And so my position was, what greater time to preach the gospel than right now?
You said 2 things from a leadership standpoint that I thought were interesting. One, that you managed your energy because you couldn't do it without you. And 2, that while everything wasn't planned out, you moved forward. So tell us about how leaders can move forward in ambiguity.
Mm-hmm. So Todd Bolsinger has a great book where he talks about leading off of the map, right? And he talks about how Lewis and Clark, thought they were going to do this great expedition and find this waterway that would lead them to the west. And once they got across the mountain range, they realized, oh, there's no water.
That book is Canoeing the Mountains. We'll have that in the show notes for everybody.
Thank you. And as they're making their way, now they've got to make a leadership decision. We came with canoes, but now we need wagons. Do we turn back because this is not what we anticipated? So what they did was they traded their canoes for wagons. Some people settled where they were, but they moved forward by innovating and realizing, even though this is not what I planned to do, our destination has not changed, just the means by which we get there. And so leaders are clear about mission and then are able to make the ministry pivots, shout out to Reverend Russ, in order to get to where they're trying to go.
Shout out to Reverend Russ with the Ministry Pivot podcast. Again, we'll link that in the show notes. You got to check that one out too. So you're moving forward in this. Pandemic is longer than any of us could have imagined, but you've now got this building. What did you do as a leader? Because now there's another transition. People got used to worshiping at home. What did you do to get people to pivot and transition again?
So I don't want to overshoot the runway and claim more credit than necessary or appropriate. The truth of the matter is God's timing aligned perfectly with our build schedule. Sure. So by the time the construction was complete, we're now in spring of 2022. Easter's coming. Easter is going to be our first day in the building. And that's just the time where people are really starting to feel comfortable to come back. I actually have a colleague, the only person I know that built during the pandemic was Dr. Marcus Cosby down at Wheeler Avenue Baptist in Houston. And his construction ended earlier. He actually was able to go into his building in the fall. And when we spoke, he said, yeah, they're not really coming back like I, anticipated or like we desire. But by the spring, his folks started coming back at the same time. So it just so happens that God aligned our construction schedule with sort of the algorithm of society in terms of its comfort level and coming back. And so that really was great for us because it served as another restart. So if you really think about it, when we started back in 2006 as Reed Temple North, we got to sort of set the stage as the new ministry. In 2010, we went to our new building. And the old Winston Churchill phrase is, first you shape your buildings, then your buildings shape you. And so that became another reset. 2019, we become Kingdom Fellowship. That became another reset. 2020, we hit the pandemic. Well, of course, that's another reset. And then we go into our new building now in 2022. That's another reset. So even though Kingdom Fellowship was a 4-year-old church, we're a 4-year-old church, we've had 3 resets in our short history. And each time it became the opportunity for us to reimagine and refocus and reprioritize the things we wanted to go after as a ministry.
Now, what's interesting in that, you mentioned 3 really hard resets and a couple smaller ones in there. A lot of times, ministers, leaders will get calcified in how they do things. What did you do personally to keep yourself nimble as a leader so you didn't try to force what was into what was becoming and into what could be?
Sure. So the other Churchill quote I love is never waste a crisis. Each crisis for me felt like an opportunity to say, hey, let's think about, does this still make sense? Or are there things that we need to pronounce benediction over in order for us to then baptize something new and something fresh? I think especially for pastors and leaders who find themselves leading organizations that have long histories and traditions and cultures, to never waste the opportunity that crisis brings, because it sort of focuses the locus of authority within that individual that they otherwise would not enjoy, because when things are static, things move slow. So the concept is acute disequilibrium theory. And basically it says when the organization is at equilibrium, then the bureaucracy slows things down. You have to go through the normal political process. You have to go through the gatekeepers that are normally there. But in disequilibrium, when there's a crisis, all that kind of goes away and you're able to do a lot in a very short amount of time. Now, the question becomes, how do you lead outside of a crisis? And I think the answer to that is to take some of the opportunities that you would have in a crisis and recreate them outside. So let me give you an old illustration I heard Pastor Washington use probably over 20 years ago, and he's not even an illustration guy. He said he was flying on a plane one day, and he looked out, and the guy next to him said, hey, you see those little things on the wings, those little ridges? He said, do you know what those are? And Pastor Washington said, no, I don't. He said, those are called force vector generators. And he said, well, what's that? He said, the job of those little things on the wing is to actually disturb the flow of air. He said, the air flows over the wings so easily that the wing sometimes can't get enough lift. And so the force generator causes there to be enough tension that now all of a sudden you can get lift. So as a leader, sometimes you have to do what's called raising the leadership temperature in the organization. You have to create tension that then disturbs the equilibrium so that you can then move things forward. You have to shake it up. You have to take some people out of their normal positions. You have to challenge people in terms of why they're defending a specific part of the tradition because it's not in the Bible. And as you have those courageous conversations, you raise the temperature sufficiently enough that now you can move the organization forward. Here's the last lesson that we learn sort of from the grounded theory of leadership, which is you can't lead without courage, because you're going to have to face down some strongholds. Every organization has them. You're going to have to face down some people who have friends and ties and supporters. You're going to have to face down some challenges of resources and reprioritizing limited money or space. And in order to do what's necessary, you're going to have to make some difficult decisions and trust that God is in the midst of them. And if God is leading you, God will not demand what he doesn't supply.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot, and that is awesome. So, got all that, and now we're just getting to 2023. Outreach Magazine names you the fastest growing church in America. Can you tell us a little about, you've given us a lot of foundation, but what is if you had to pin it down to one or two things in the culture, DNA, or leadership that has allowed you to do that kind of new building coming out of pandemic in the midst of what is really kind of what you said, disequilibrium? There's a lot going on all at the same time, yet you've been able to, in a very deliberate and structured way, evangelize and assimilate new people. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Great. So at the end of the day, for me, this comes down to preaching the gospel. That I want to make a distinction between leadership lessons and theories and practices and models and all that kind of stuff, which is great. But at the end of the day, preaching is what, in my view, still makes the ministry. In the age of podcasts and YouTube and constant content from Netflix and every place else, people have no shortage of access to content. The question is what makes our content unique. And so the same attention and passion I have for preaching in 2023 is what I had in 2006 when we were in the high school. When we were in the high school, all we had was preaching because we had nothing in the environment that said, come here.
So you kept the main thing, no matter how much the thing grew.
Absolutely. And so, having a new building never hurts. Architectural evangelism, people come in, they want to be, curious about what's happening, but they will be kept because they feel like they're being fed and they feel like this is a place that is welcoming. So we've had any number of persons come and say, I really wasn't open to a big church, but this church doesn't feel big. And I think that's true. I've been to storefront churches that felt cold, not because of the size, but because of the culture of the people. So that same healthy DNA that we started with in 2006 has continued to spawn itself each generation since we've been alive. But I think for me, core is continuing to preach the gospel. And for me, the gospel is still an offense, according to scripture, right? That it doesn't co-sign on what the culture says. In fact, oftentimes it takes the polar opposite view. And just like courage is necessary for leadership, courage is necessary for preaching, probably now more than ever. That still, and being in a very liberal environment in the DC area, oftentimes I stand up knowing that what I say will not accord itself with where the culture is. And so I have to decide that if I trust that this is the gospel, that even if people don't agree, they will respect that I'm sincere about my belief in what I'm preaching. And so we've seen people respond to the gospel and then be kept both by, I think, healthy culture and the other part of your question, healthy systems. So we have revamped our intake process. We tried to streamline it. Our focus is on making disciples and not making church members. And so we want to be very scripturally led. We want to allow people's testimonies to impact the lives of persons that are coming in. And then we want to lower the barrier of entry for folks to connect with online learning and small groups, because we think those kinds of small communities and those kinds of direct access to sound teaching are the things that really help people to grow and stick and stay.
Kingdom Fellowship, fastest growing church in the country right now. Let me ask you this question on behalf of the average pastor. By statistics, the average church in America right now is 65 people, but no pastor doesn't want to reach people. Where would you tell the average pastor, maybe 65 people in worship, 100 people in worship, what would you tell them is how they start so they can get their church moving again?
Sure. I think you start with figuring out what is your superpower. What is it uniquely that God has given you, right? It may not be preaching on Sunday morning. It may be that you have great interpersonal skills. It may be great. You may be great as a chaplain or a person who does really well in hospital settings. I am the last person you want to call if you're not feeling well.
To thine own self be true.
Listen, man, you don't want those problems. You don't want me coming into, hey, because I'm going to say like, wow, you look bad. Woo, can we get somebody else? I mean, I'm going to pray, but I'm not sure if you're going to make it. Listen, you have to know who you are. And then you have to know what is the strategic advantage of that congregation. Every church has something that it brings to the table, right? So it could be location. It could be its history. It could be the people that attend that church and their connections in that community. But every church has something. And then there are some opportunities that have nothing to do with Sunday morning. The fact that we have social media, and as an individual, you have the same platform as people who have thousands, hundreds of millions of followers. So figuring that out. I have a good friend who used to see a couple hundred people on Sunday morning, but he had hundreds of thousands of people following him online. And so widening the aperture of your understanding of what ministry can be, what your own superpower is, and the strategic advantages that God has placed where you are the places that you start. Who am I? Where am I? And how has God uniquely equipped me to lead? And if you start looking at sort of what God said to Moses, what's in your hand, that's the starting point. But it doesn't start from a place of cynicism. It starts with the belief that I fundamentally have something to offer the world. My value proposition is that the world needs what God has given me. And all I have to do is figure out how to make that connection.
Awesome. Listen, before we get out of here, I like to end the podcast with 3 things just to kind of let people get to know you a little bit better. So 3 questions from Matthew Watley. Number 1, favorite sports team?
The New York Football Giants.
New York Football Giants. You, like me, my friend, are a man of faith because this is not going well for us.
We're going to get you a ring every 5 to 7 years. It's going to be cold in between. But yeah, we're going to come through after a while.
But we're going to get you one. Second question, favorite restaurant in the country?
Favorite restaurant in the country? I'm going to go ahead and say the Lobster Bar down in Fort Lauderdale.
Okay.
They do a fried lobster tail. Do not die and go to heaven before you experience it.
And last but not least, one thing you want everybody to know about Matthew Watley.
I love the Lord, I love my family, and I love my job.
Amen. This has been Pastor Matthew Watley, the senior pastor of the Kingdom Fellowship AME Church, the fastest growing church in America in 2023. Pastor Watley, thank you so much for being our initial podcast guest. And of course, you are also the founder and chair of the TKN board. So of course, we would start with the man in charge. And thank you all for joining us. Again, TKN is here for you. Our goal is to help you move forward and upward in your leadership to get you to the next level. So follow, subscribe, follow us on social. Make sure you get those show notes because you don't want to miss a thing. And we'll see you next time.